Hello and welcome to Politics Today. I'm Farrukh Pitafi. I'm sure with the curtain raiser that you just saw, you must have got some idea of where we are headed with today's discussion. As we speak, viewers, in Washington, D.C., in the U.S. Congress, there is a very important hearing that is going on. The U.S. Military leaders are briefing the Senate Armed Services Committee on Afghanistan withdrawal, and this is called hearing. The hearing so far has been quite grilling, but that goes on. On the other side, there is another very interesting development. I'm sure that you have seen by now the book written by Bob Woodward and Bob Costa. And in that book, there were many revelations. Fascinating thing about that book is that it is very current. It actually ends only a few months ago. So amazingly, there were many truth bombs. But initially, it was thought that they might be an occasion when General Milley, the U.S. Chairman Joint Staff, might have actually gone against the remit and talked to his Chinese counterparts regarding de-escalation or possibility of de-escalation. But later on, and as we are hearing today as well, the fact remains that this de-escalation was within his remit, a remit of his duties. We are going to talk about the future of world order, of course. Our editorial team seems to have had an opinion on multipolarity. But the fact is that things keep on changing. One, today General Milley was asked whether the withdrawal from Afghanistan damaged America's repute. And General Milley said that damaged was one word that can be used. There are many others, but this is one of those words. So there is this image. On the other side, of course, we are going to talk about the need for all to work together. Naturally, a couple of days ago, we saw Narendra Modi was in Washington, D.C., participating in the Quad meeting. Quad was earlier being talked up as a security alliance, although it is a security dialogue. But later on, we saw that with AUKUS, its importance seems to be secondary, because the fourth member that is left out of AUKUS and which is part of Quad, Japan, is already has a bilateral military treaty with the U.S. We are going to talk about the future of world order, the world after Afghanistan withdrawal. Of course, we are going to talk about Afghanistan situation at this moment as well. And then we are going to talk about the US-China equation, because recently a very interesting development has just surfaced. If you remember the Huawei confrontation, their COO was arrested in Canada 1 year ago, 1.5 years ago. She was allowed to travel back to China. So that is a development that shows you that there might be some thought. On the other side, we have AUKUS and Quad and umpteen other forums. Today, in order to help us understand these issues, we are joined by a very eminent panel. Professor Dr. Adil Najam Saab joins us on Skype. He is Dean, Boston University, Purdy School. Thank you very much, Dr. Adil Najam, for being part of the program. And Tariq Farhadi Saab, after a while, joins us. He is an Afghan analyst, but an expert on regional affairs, economic affairs as well, has advised the previous Afghan governments as well. Tariq Farhadi Saab, thank you very much for being part of the program as well. At this moment, Adil Najam Saab, when we are looking at how the withdrawal took place, is it correct to say that there is room to speculate about the America's image abroad and America's leadership?
I think, in fairness, it's more than room. It's not a question of to speculate. Clearly, within the U.S. and within everywhere, there are questions that, as you would have expected, uh, are being raised about the US role, the US leadership, the way the withdrawal happened, the implications of the withdrawal, what was achieved in those 20 years, what is left behind. Those are natural questions, right? So I don't think one needs to speculate about it. I think the speculation is about where those questions will lead. So clearly, the US made this decision, Mr. Biden made this decision, knowing full well that you cannot sort of have this sort of a mammoth decision made and the world wouldn't notice. That was not an option. That the US would just leave and the world would not notice. Now the question is, what does that mean for how the world looks at US leadership, US policy in the future? Now, again, one point of reference is the Soviets had left at an earlier point and how that was received and what that meant. The Americans clearly understand that, but the Americans also understand that that's probably not the right reference point. The Soviet Union of then wasn't what the US is now. Their withdrawal wasn't exactly the same type. Their withdrawal was in some ways far more complete than the US intends it to be. Nor is the world ever the same. The world of 2021 has a larger story than Afghanistan. So much as I understand the constant 24/7 focus on Afghanistan in Pakistan, actually I don't understand it fully, but the fact is that what we are looking at in that Afghanistan is a very major dot, but it's not the only dot. So even without Afghanistan, there was a very fast growing tension between the Chinese and the Americans. That remains the most defining element, far more than the events in Afghanistan. And in some ways, that is overshadowing America's role in Afghanistan as well as China's. And that's how you would expect the world chess play table to be played. So I guess what I'm saying is, yes, there are questions about the role, but the real questions are about the future.
Right. And that is a fair analysis. With your permission, I have to bring in Tariq Farhadi Saab. Tariq Farhadi Saab, today one question that was repeatedly being asked by the US senators was whether the US could have stayed beyond this deadline when they actually pulled out, when they withdrew. And the answer from the leadership, it seemed, was quite clear that, no matter what you did, you could not keep propping up a government that was so ready to sit down and disappear the moment you left. Your take on this, then we move forward about the leadership of the US.
Yes, on the leadership of the U.S., the deal that has damaged a little bit the reputation of the U.S. Is the AUKUS deal, Australia-UK-U.S. deal, which really put the French, which are old ally of the United States, at the situation where they even called back their ambassador. So there is a certain amount of unpredictability where even the French foreign minister said that this was a Trumpian move from the Biden administration. So beyond Biden or Trump, is the U.S. an ally? Because Trump also had said that he would like to get out of Germany. Remember that? Even Europe is wondering if the U.S. is the ally it says to be. At least the facts have shown this. On Afghanistan, if the U.S. had stayed, yes, they said we could have stayed, but we should have sent back more soldiers. We should have sent back 15,000 more to keep the status quo. We would have had to start fighting again with the Taliban, where this deal was a deal to stop the fighting and eventually to get out. But I think both Trump and Biden are older generation politicians, and at some point they arrived at the conclusion that it's not worth it to spend all this money in Afghanistan. For Trump in the middle of COVID, and that he wanted to protect the financial interests of the United States with the Chinese, but in Afghanistan there was this open spigot of money being spent. And Trump also, and Biden has said several times, it cost us $300 million a day to be there. So this is what the how they justify to the American people that, look, we were involved in some things there that didn't make any sense for us. It wasn't worth the cost.
Right. But what is your personal take, sir? Do you think that if had US actually stayed, it could have actually created an environment where Afghan government could have become self-reliant and could have survived for longer time? Because in 11 days, I mean, to any punter, any expert on these matters, it seems quite dramatic that a government would collapse this dramatically, no?
The government in Afghanistan couldn't have survived, nor improved its reliability, nor improved its sustainability. It was a corrupt government. Some of this money was going in the pockets of people. The US was paying for 300,000 soldiers' salaries. And amazingly enough, for the last 3 months, even the Ghani administration had not paid the soldiers. So there were some people who were picking up money, and the US was paying for the maintenance of the Humvees, the US was paying for the fuel of the Humvees, but none of this money really went where it was supposed to be. And one of the things that was said in Congress today is that, look, we had withdrawn some of our advisors early on, and months before the withdrawal, we didn't have any visibility on what's going on really within the Afghan National Army.
Right. Let me go back to Dr. Adil Najam. Dr. Saab, the great thing about talking to you is that you understand science, you understand economics, and you, of course, understand international relations as well. One aspect, and I'm glad that you actually pointed out how the relationship between the US and China have degraded of late, and it started almost 20 years ago with the advent of Bush government, and after that things have gone down. But because of that, we have seen that it has negatively impacted the availability of microchips. It has actually created a lot of problem for global economy. Do you think that this idea of decoupling or this idea of creating a multipolar world is even possible in today's integrated economic world?
Farrukh, very good question. I want to come to this, if you allow me, just one thought on what Tariq Sahib was saying very correctly. But you know, we talk of 11 days. The Ghani government didn't fall in 11 days. That's a myth. That's a newspaper headline. That government fell in 18 years. Okay. So essentially, and it's all, the other myth is that Taliban somehow took over. What happened was the fall of a government, and then vacuum has its own science of its own. So in some ways, I think as we think about what happened, that was laid in stone, certainly when the Doha agreement was happening. And in that agreement, if you look, the Americans didn't involve Kabul. So once they did that, this became inevitable. And in some ways, maybe Mr. Khalilzad thought that, you know, since Mr. Ghani is our man, we will just tell him what to do and he will do it. But that would have been a really bad understanding of how real politics works. Coming back to what you are saying, which I think is really a very interesting question, again, to be the contrarian here, in a way, a multipolar world is now not just inevitable, I think it is there. Now, but that doesn't mean that multipolar is stable. Right? So we are used to a type of multipolar when there were two established big powers, the Soviets and the Americans, right? So all three of us have grown in that sort of worldview. What I think has fallen, whether there is a multipolar or not, the unipolar is over. And the unipolar might have been over for a long time. And the unipolar was unilaterally declared at the end of the Cold War. At the fall of the Soviet Union. For a certain time, unipolar, I think, was propped up by globalization. This is the thing I think many of my colleagues don't fully understand here in the US, that the greatest force that was keeping up unipolarity was that sort of summer of globalization, of global trade, of internet, of everything coming together in these agreements and so on and so forth, that was the force propping up the idea of unipolarity, which the Chinese also were willing to live with and would have preferred to live with because it served their purpose too. Now, once that sense of globalization started crumbling, pre-Trump, but certainly during that period, then that myth of unipolarity also started crumbling because, in a way, that left China with no choice. And in some ways, maybe the US moves, including on the agreement that was mentioned by Mr. Tariq, is pushing China into that sort of, whether it's a confrontation in military terms or not, it could be in trade terms, but clearly now the screens are off on both the Chinese and the American side.
Right.
And
Dr.
that
Saab, I'm really glad that you brought up globalization because a gift of globalization was global supply chains. And it seems that there is so much depending on that. I brought up the issue of microchips and umpteen other products. It seems that it is nearly impossible. I understand that unipolarity might not be there. Whether it was there in first place or it was merely a construct, we don't know. But regarding globalization and these supply chains and complementing each other economically, do you think that it is just going to stop?
It's not. I mean, dynamics are going to take over, and something else is going to happen. Nature doesn't like vacuum, so there's going to be a push on microchips. A very interesting manifestation here in the US is that car prices have gone up. Now, that's also helped a lot of people. The reason car prices have gone up is that US car manufacturers do not have enough of, especially the microchip components that are now necessary in modern cars. So the reason I give you these examples is that even for something like microchips, you might immediately think, okay, we are talking computers or we are talking cell phones. But the impact in those supply chains that you're talking about are so great that it moves many things. Now, when it moves many things, and this is why I'm saying there is an inevitability of something will happen. The world markets are now actually so interconnected that unconnecting them will take a lot of toll. Now, Mr. Trump did try that with the cell phones, with Hawaii.
Yeah.
Right? And the jury is still out on whether that can be done. Now, obviously it can be done by force, but when you do these things by force, then you create new constituencies who will push back, right? New economic constituencies, manufacturers who are less interested in global power dynamics and more interested in global market dynamics. Now, COVID has also given this push to supply chains that we are going to produce everything together, everything ourselves. But that's not going to be easy. It's a cost thing. Last thing, I've spoken too much, but last thing, it's also not as if all is cool at the China front. Yeah. Interestingly, China is now facing a labor shortage in manufacturing. Right. That's an amazing statement to make. This is a country of over a billion
And Dr.
people.
Saab, we are going to talk about China in detail in the second segment. We are going to actually address that as well. But I just wanted to understand the global connectivity issue and how this is going to play out. Let me go back to Tariq Farhadi Saab, because Tariq Farhadi Saab understands economics as well. Dr. Saab, it felt for a moment that there is a force, economic force, that is trying to connect the world and bring everybody together. And there are parts which might be left outside, and they will be brought in within the purview of development and progress. Do you think that at this moment we can convince ourselves that that is not going to happen? And whatever you may call it, globalization, interconnectivity, global supply chains, they are going to just disappear, things are going to fall apart?
You see, what made globalization possible was technology as well. In the past 20 years, the internet, the mobile technology, many things that have happened that were not possible 20 years ago. today we are speaking on this Skype line.
Yeah.
The Skype didn't exist 20 years ago, I think. So basically the integration of the world and this globalization of supply chains and trade has, the backbone of this globalization has been the technology revolution. It started in the Silicon Valley in the early 90s with Cisco, etc. But then at that point, the American companies, in order to look for efficiencies, including chip-making companies like Applied Materials and KLA-10 Core, etc., they went to China. They said, there's no limit to efficiency, so we are even going to work with other places, as Elon Musk went to China to make cars for less money. So, and the Chinese were very adept at adopting new technologies, whether it was at the beginning by copying, but now they produce the Huawei phones. So they have had this ability to catch up very fast on the technology, which allowed them to be, from the moment where they were integrated into WTO as a developing country.
All right.
This is what Trump was always complaining about. And now they're a developed country, and they control globalization in a way because they went beyond what the United States expected. The Chinese created ties with the Europeans. The Europeans are reluctant to break those ties with the Chinese. That's one of the issues that the US was talking about with Macron, because Macron was resisting to break ties with the Chinese and take an antagonistic stance with vis-a-vis the Chinese. Macron was saying this is a business partner for us. Europe is saying this is a business partner for us. Switzerland has a free trade agreement with China. Switzerland is in the center of Europe. And the Europeans are looking at ways of how to have a free trade agreement without being eaten alive, because their industry is old and their industry is now very connected. The Italians went to China and made all kinds of deals with the Chinese, and even brought the Chinese in north of Italy to create the total integration of the value chains. So, and China also has been in
Right,
Africa.
Because we have arrived at discussing China, allow me to actually take a break, then we are going to start the segment specifically on China-US relations. Let us take a break. When we come back, because we are going to talk about all these matters and more, then we have to also talk about how this competition, rivalry or multipolarity affect our own region, India, Pakistan, South Asia. Take a break. Welcome back. Before going to the break, we were talking about the possibility of another Cold War or some kind of competition. Of course, media and pundits are always keen on, branding everything. So they are in a hurry to give everything a title, right? So multipolarity is a title, declining power, the US is a title, and then of course the rise of China is again a construct, a title. There are two very interesting things about both these perspectives. On one side, when you talk about the US as a declining power, and remember when Afghanistan withdrawal was going on, there was an effort to compare the pictures with Saigon moment. And amazingly, if you remember at that time too, it was said that the US is going to decline, and yet its opponent actually declined, the US survived. Even at this moment, we are hearing lawmakers talk about the possibility that US might be declining. On the other side, when you talk about China, Huawei issue was quite instructive, because it was thought that the Chinese business had stood up and it was rising and very powerful. But frankly, Trump administration's measures or boycott or ban on Huawei actually has hurt it regarding technology, the way it has just moved out of your and my markets where a US software cannot be used. So it is always complicated. Let me come back to Dr. Adil Najm. Dr. Saab, you were talking about labor shortages and labor problem in China. Please resume that issue, sir, that talk.
So my point there simply being that, when you have this sort of global power shift, it impacts everything and it impacts everyone. So one of the, yesterday's two interesting headlines for me from the financial press were one about sort of rising car costs in the US because of microchips, and the other was about labor shortages in China. And the reason I smiled at that was you could never really imagine shortage of labor in China simply because of its size, right? We've talked about it as the factory to the world, 1 billion people. And the labor shortage story essentially is that as economy rises, people don't want to work in low-paying manufacturing jobs, right? As everywhere, as happened in the US. So it's more of a signal of the Chinese rising, but it has implications on others. In some ways, the China factory, if you will, moved quite a little while ago already to Vietnam, to other parts of Asia, and so on, so forth. So that's the shift you will see. And in some ways, the terms that you started the question with are all correct. Though I think it is less about a US decline than it is about a Chinese rise. Right? Great powers shift for multiple reasons. Something happens in a great power and it implodes itself. I don't think there is much evidence of seeing that in the US. Or someone else comes up and starts rising very fast so that the relative balance changes. And I think that's what we are seeing. I think again in the summer of globalization, when we were all gaga about it, the hope was that this rise of a new major power would be an economic rise that would not lead to the type of other confrontations that we usually see in moments of great power shifts. Right. Between Trump and now Mr. Biden, it seems that the US would like to push the timeline on confrontation, partly because the US sees itself as the bigger power and wants to capture the strength of the bigger power while China is still a relatively smaller power. And that is why the French reaction that was mentioned is so important, because the question is, will other countries, particularly other large countries as in Europe, live to the US pressure to disengage with China? Or are we already in a world where, frankly, disengagement is not an option? That isolating China as a Soviet Union might also have been isolated to its own bloc may simply not be an option. Let me give you one challenge to both of you, one line.
Right. I want to come back to you, sir, but I just wanted to, perhaps it is because I keep on trying to see a silver lining in any relationship, and I still want the world to work together because there are many challenges, one of which you have been working against for quite some time, that is climate change. But at this moment, while on one side we are talking about the possibility that these two powers are going to confront each other, the way they have been complementing. And then there are many other elements. For example, France. In France, of course, their stance can be attributed to how the US was treating EU, but it can also be attributed to what President Macron is going through within the country. There is a lot of pushback against him. So is there a possibility that we are actually perceiving the coming conflict too prematurely? And there is a possibility that the world still will have to work together and we are not actually moving towards a Cold War?
I hope so. I hope so. I very much hope so. Here is what I'm confident of. France, and I'm sorry I took the question if it was meant for me, but France, clearly internal politics at stake and business politics. This is about submarines and who gets to sell submarines to Australia as much as it is about China, right? So let's not forget that. But in a way, here is what my silver lining is. I do not think that China clearly would prefer not to have a confrontation, at least not now.
Right,
Like
right.
that's clear. If they had
That's a
their wish,
very that's a very
right, they
good
would
point,
want
sir. Allow me
attrition.
to actually go to Tariq Farhadi Saab very quickly as well. Tariq Farhadi Saab, while we were talking about how both these powers are being perceived, you can say that the US is declining or whether it is declining at all. But regarding China, there was this talk of China's rise, and that essentially is driven by its economic performance. And now we are seeing that at least there are accusations in the Western media that China is cracking down on big business within the country. And there is a possibility that it might be going back, moving towards socialism again. But do you think that that is a possibility? And how does that play out, sir?
Well, the rise of China in the last 20 or 25 years has been made possible by them espousing the capitalist model, basically. Alibaba and so many other um, companies in China and Chongqing and all these cities that sprung up and the government has espoused, in fact, capitalism and let it play. And this, because it was the model of the West, and it was very easy to conquer the West through the economy. As I mentioned, the Italians went to China to bring agreements, and it's them that invited the Chinese to even do fashion for Italy. Hermes, which is a French brand, has its only other factory in China. You see? Yeah. So the best way to avoid a Cold War is to let this economic integration happen. It has already happened. It's unstoppable. The business culture in the United States wants this integration. When Trump was putting these tariffs, there were businesses that were cringing in the Silicon Valley, etc. As why we are making money by working closely with China. In Europe, it's the same feeling, is that there are opportunities for American companies, European companies, again, Tesla to sell cars in China. It's a huge market. China will be, I mean, the most number of tourists will come out of Asia in the next 2 decades. The most number of aircrafts ordered will be in Asia and China in the next 2 decades. Because that's where the population of the world is. If you look at the weight of the population of the world, that's where it is. And that's where technology and science and progress is going to create the economic move, basically.
I understand, Tariq Sahab, that the world's most of the world's population is in this region. But when you look at PPP parity between the US and these countries and per capita income, you do see that there is still a lot of disparity, and that is not going to go away overnight. I mean, there are issues of efficiency still when it comes to India or China's domestic wealth creation. Is it not true?
Yes, India has been limited by an old legal system it has inherited from the British, plus what has happened after that. And American companies such as Walmart went to India, thought they would make a lot of money in India, but once they discovered the bureaucracy, they said, no, we are coming out. It's too complicated. And an insistence by the Indians to transfer technology also has been met, only the French have decided that the Rafale aircraft, which is a very old aircraft that they are trying to sell to some countries that can't afford other military aircraft, they have agreed to let this be assembled in India. But India, to their own national interest maybe, but they insist on transfer of technology. And in technology, what gives you the advance over others is patents. it's
That's
the other
that's
key.
a fascinating answer. Let me go back very quickly to Dr. Adil Najam. Dr. Saab, we are running out of time, but I want you to actually come in on India, especially its position. On one side, it seems that this environment was ideal for India to actually cash on. On one side, you're talking about confrontation environment. It can align with either country and make a lot of hay. On the other side, it has the weaknesses like Narendra Modi being its prime minister right now. That's a huge liability. And then the country actually managed not to create its currency as an individual player. I mean, Chinese currency is very powerful. American currency actually runs the show around the world. But where is Indian currency? So what happens to India in this model, sir, in this coming world?
Big question, big question, but a relatively smaller question than the bigger question, which is what happens to our region. We started talking about Afghanistan, so if you take the region from there to India to Pakistan, Iran, this whole region is clearly going to be affected by these. When elephants fight, the ants are going to be trampled over and elephants are going to be fighting here. That is quite clear, just because of geography. So that's point one. In terms of India, you are right that in some ways India's choices are much clearer in this case than any of the other regional players. Because India is also a billion plus country. India historically sees itself as a rival to China, if not an opponent, but clearly a rival to China. So basically, on that old principle of of an enemy's enemy is my friend, the Indian choices are very clear, whether it is Mr. Modi or not. That India leans to whoever is against China at this point. That is clearly the US. And then there is India's own dynamic to be pro-US right now, because one of the most vibrant, richest, strongest diasporas in the US today is the Indian diaspora. So there are these two logics of politics that makes India quite clear in its choices, and I don't think that's a surprise. The question is, what will the others do? So in some ways, if I can be mischievous, Farrukh, I think because India is doing this time what Pakistan did in the earlier Cold War by leaning US, maybe Pakistan should do what India did, which is not lean either way, right? Not choose
Being
sides.
non-aligned. That is a very
But
interesting
some
point.
is a smart thing to
That's
do
a
when
very
elephants
good point, sir. I'm told that we are left with very little time. Allow me to go back to Tariq Farhadi Saab. Tariq Farhadi Saab, I want to understand how this changing world impacts our region, and very quickly, India and Pakistan. Afghanistan has been a victim of hostility between India and Pakistan as well, because both countries have a very different approach to Afghanistan. Do you think that there will come a time when India and Pakistan can work together?
I hope so. I hope so, because both countries are also English speaking, and they can catch on to technology quicker than any non-English speaking country. And the future is going to be about technology and being able to integrate into the larger value chains of business. For China, the attraction of Pakistan is that it gives it access to the southern seas, and that's what it is. So it's about exporting, it's about creating the best routes, the most efficient routes, and India, Pakistan as an integrated economic concept is ideal. Why not? The line was drawn by colonization.
All right. Right. That's a debatable point, and you have dropped the bomb at the very end of the program. But I'm told that we have to conclude the program here. Tariq Farhadi Saab, thank you very much, sir, for being part of the program. Professor Dr. Adil Najam Saab, always great listening to you, sir, having you on the show. Thank you very much, sir, for being part of the program. While we are talking, there are many challenges that are facing the world. One is COVID-19. Why else would I be carrying this mask along? And then we all are getting vaccinated, and there are many challenges. Then there is the issue of climate change. rising poverty, complications, violence at a subnational level all over the world. It is important to remember that in the end we are sitting on the same rock, and because of these fights we might be undermining that rock and our collective future on that rock. While we are talking about the importance of China and America working together rather than fighting, India and Pakistan is another, they give another example where both should be able to get along. But it seems that with the current government in India, that becomes quite a problematic thing. And we have seen that this time even the American diaspora was not that much receptive to how Narendra Modi was actually there and how he was moving around. So that becomes a problem too. In the end, collective security means working together, not being polarized. I don't know whether that is a possibility, but let us hope in coming days we see an example of that translating all over the world. This was today's program. Thank you very much for watching. Take care.